We've got a real shot here, Bernadette. An entire community starts attributing the daily horrors of their lives to a mythical figure.
I mean, you do know the story, don't you?
I can't say nothing. A Candyman'll get me.
Candyman isn't real!
Be my victim.
Helen and Lyle was out here looking for Candyman. You ask me, I say she found him.
What's Candyman?
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Explained here on Burns Reviews. But before we begin, just a disclaimer to let you know, we were going to be spoiling the hell out of this movie. So if you have never seen this movie, be sure to go check it out, come back. We might have a spoiler-free review. If we do, I'll leave a link right there. And also, we have a table of content where you can jump around and go into the movie in different ways. I'll leave time codes down below. Without any further ado, let's talk about it. Candyman first hooked audiences with its wide release on August 27th, 2021. Up against a budget of $25 million, it made an impressive $22 million domestically and another $5 million overseas. An impressive box office considering the climate in which the film came out. But where does Candyman come from, and how did he become the legend that he is today? Our story begins back in 1985, when Clive Barker released his fifth novella within the Books of Blood series entitled The Forbidden. It would serve as the main source material for the 1992 film, keeping the overall outline, but was given some major changes that were made for the better. The setting was changed from London to Chicago, Candyman was originally a white man with yellowish skin, and Helen is writing a dissertation on graffiti, but there are no elements of an urban legend. The act of saying his name 5 times in the mirror was not even included in the original, but was rather based on the tale of Bloody Mary. I believe this is a rare case where the film is actually better than the source material. Not that the novella isn't great, but it's rather short and would have had to been fleshed out anyway. I can't imagine the 92 film being shown as a direct adaptation. I imagine it would have had a feeling more akin to Interview with a Vampire than the story that we know today. In the 92 film, we are introduced to Daniel Robitaille, who is played perfectly by Tony Todd. Robitaille was the son of a slave on a plantation in New Orleans. He was chosen by wealthy landowner Hayward Sullivan to paint a portrait of his daughter, Caroline, resulting in a love affair between the two. After Caroline became pregnant, however, Hayward organized a lynch mob to hunt Daniel down. The mob cut off his right hand and covered him with honey from a nearby beehive. A small boy tasted the honey and exclaimed, "Candyman." The crowd chanted the name as Daniel was brutally stung multiple times. Hayward then taunted the disfigured Daniel by showing him his reflection in Caroline's mirror. However, in doing so, it would be the item that would trap his soul, resulting in the mirror granting the Candyman his ability to kill when called upon. In 1992, we meet Helen Lyle, a grad student who is researching the myth of the Candyman in hopes that she can make a name for herself within her academic community. But let's be real, it's really just so that she can stick to this guy. As well as her condescending husband who doesn't believe in her. As part of her research, she says his name 5 times in the mirror. This of course is a terrible idea as it turns out to be real. She goes to the Cabrini Green housing project to investigate the murder of Ruthie Jean when she learns from a custodian that Candyman is possibly the culprit.
Yeah, but I don't know nothing about that.
Along the way, she meets Annie Marie McCoy and her baby Anthony McCoy, who of course would go on to be the main character of Candyman 2021 nearly 29 years later. She tells her that she's afraid of Candyman and that Helen and her friend should stay clear. Later on, Helen goes to check out a public bathroom, only to be beaten up by a local gang, which is led by a man claiming to be Candyman. With the man arrested, Helen is now convinced that Candyman is just a myth, and that the locals have made him up as a means of dealing with their trauma.
Candyman isn't real.
This of course infuriates Robitaille, as one of his true motivations is to keep his own legend alive. As he says, "I am the writing on the wall, the whisper in the classroom. Without these things, I am nothing."
Helen.
Robitaille then decides to go on a murder spree, killing everyone in Helen's life, so that his legend will stay alive. This kind of works. Helen definitely believes in him now. However, as it turns out, everyone thinks that Helen has lost her mind and that she is the real person behind these string of murders. Also, it turns out that Helen is a reincarnation of Robitaille's former lover, Caroline Sullivan, so he wants her for himself as well.
You're mine now.
With everyone convinced that Helen is the one behind the murders, she goes to the secret lair in Cabrini Green in an attempt to save the baby that has been stolen. She is able to save the child, but not at the cost of her own life. I personally have never seen Candyman until 2020 when I decided to use the early days of the pandemic to watch a bunch of horror films I had never seen before. I remember seeing it often at my local Blockbuster as a kid and thinking it looked visually striking. The I and the B gave me strong vibes of Silence of the Lambs, and I always wanted to know what Stu Macher was referring to when he referred to it in the movie Scream, one of my absolute favorites.
Oh, you mean after you branded him the Candyman? No, his heart's broken now.
My overall thoughts on the film were strongly positive. I recall thinking of it as a hidden gem of the 90s that I wish I had found sooner. Todd is perfect in the role, and I'm so glad the studio was unable to afford Eddie Murphy at the time, as it would have changed the film completely. According to Virginia Madsen, director Bernard Rose originally wanted his first sequel, Candyman 2, to be a prequel, showing Candyman and Helen's look-alike falling in love. But the idea was turned down because the studio was worried how a fully fledged interracial romance would be received at the time. In 1995, Candyman saw its first sequel in Candyman: Farewell to the Flesh. However, unlike its predecessor, the film received mostly negative reviews from critics and audiences alike. The film had been noted for doubling down on score, while largely abandoning the subtext and wit that made the original worthwhile. In 1999, a third entry was released directly to HBO, titled Candyman 3: Day of the Dead. However, as expected, it is regarded to be the weakest chapter in the franchise. Tony Todd openly admitted that he didn't like the third Candyman movie, and considers it to be a poor entry in the Candyman series.
Accept your destiny.
I personally haven't seen either of these sequels because I've been told they are notoriously bad and I should stay away. However, being a fan of Tony Todd, I am curious to check out part 2, if only to see the deeper backstory of Daniel Robitaille, as well as give a history of Candyman's daughter.
She's sweet, she's deadly, she's bad for your teeth.
In 2004, Tony Todd said that a fourth Candyman film was being prepared. Deon Taylor, who was set to direct, stated that he had an idea for setting it in a snowstorm at a women's college, stating, "I had an idea that they liked initially. It was going to take place in New England during a snowstorm, because I just had this image of Candyman in a blizzard. Because I'm from New England, I knew the power of having that mythic character in a snowstorm being undeterred by the elements." The film was supposed to have a budget of $25 million. Todd and Clive Barker had even discussed storyboarding ideas with crew meetings to discuss the project further. However, it was cancelled most likely because of the problem with determining who owns the Candyman rights. The franchise went from propaganda to Sony to Columbia, then to Artisan, which is now Lionsgate, with the prevalent problem being how the future profits would be divvied up. Regardless, it sounds like a fascinating idea. The idea of Candyman standing in the snow, something akin very much to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining or John Carpenter's The Thing. It really sounds pretty creepy. However, in retrospect, after glancing at Deon Taylor's filmography and what he would later go on to do, perhaps it's best that the project was left on ice. Also in 2003, after the financial success of Freddy vs. Jason, Miramax had plans to create a Candyman vs. Hellraiser crossover. But Clive Barker, originator of both franchises, had recommended against it. Tony Todd had also been pitched the idea of Candyman vs. a Leprechaun, but turned it down saying, "I will never be involved in something like that. I respect the character. Once a horror character becomes something of an icon like Candyman, reluctantly or not, you have to treat that with respect." I remember watching Abbott and Costello vs. Frankenstein continuously as a kid and being amazed that my horror legends were making a comedy. So I guess there are some ways to making something like that work, but I wasn't interested in doing that with Candyman. Then, in 2018, following the success of Get Out and Us, it was announced that Jordan Peele would produce a direct sequel to the 1992 film with MGM and Universal Pictures in a similar vein to Halloween 2018, completely omitting the existence of the sequels and picking up 29 years later where the original left off. When asked what inspired Peele to join the project, he said, "I was a horror fan as a kid, but we didn't have a black Freddy Krueger or a black Jason Voorhees. So when Candyman came along, it felt very dramatic and cathartic, and it was terrifying. Even though there are many examples of black people in horror movies, this one felt particularly badass for me." Finding a director. Early in the process of resurrecting Candyman for a new generation, Jordan Peele and fellow Monkey Paw producers Win Rosenfeld and Ian Cooper decided that they would bring in a new voice to direct the film. They found their filmmaker in Nia DaCosta, whose first feature film, Little Woods, had impressed them with the seamless melding of character-driven narrative and complex real-world issues. Casting began in January of 2019. Lakeith Stanfield, who had previously appeared in Jordan Peele's Get Out, was being eyed to star in the film as Anthony McCoy, a character who was portrayed as a baby in the original film. However, he opted instead to do Judas and the Black Messiah. A month later, it was announced that the part would be played by Yahya Abdul-Mateen II. Abdul-Mateen starred in such films such as The Greatest Showman, Black Manta in DC's Aquaman, The Trial of the Chicago 7, Dr. Manhattan in the HBO series Watchmen, and Lupita's father in the brief flashback scene in Jordan Peele's Us. The film also added Teyonah Parris from WandaVision, Colman Domingo from Fear the Walking Dead, and Vanessa Williams reprising her role as Anne Marie McCoy. 29 years later, Anthony McCoy would grow up to be a struggling artist looking for a new inspiration for his expo. Unbeknownst to him, his mother moved him out of Cabrini Green when he was 2 years old, and has never mentioned Candyman since that time. Anthony hears the legend of Candyman and finds himself going down a very similar path as Helen did in the first movie, with a few modifications. A big alteration is that Candyman is no longer just Daniel Robitaille, but has grown into several incarnations over the years and has many different faces. Or as local resident William Burke would put it, Candyman ain't a he, Candyman's a whole damn hive. Peele and DaCosta took inspiration from 2 real-life stories and paid tribute to them in the film. George Stinney, a 14-year-old boy who was sentenced to death via electric chair for the murder of 2 white girls, only to be exonerated many years later. There's also a tribute to James Byrd Jr., an African-American man who was murdered by 3 white supremacists in Jasper, Texas in 1998. Byrd was dragged for 3 miles behind a pickup truck along an asphalt road before being decapitated when hitting his head on a culvert. The murderers drove for another 1.5 miles before dumping his body in front of a black church. Of course, it is very sad that these stories happen to be true, but I commend the filmmakers for including them. It really drives the point in the story home and makes the film all the more impactful. The film also creates a new Candyman, Sherman Field, 1977. A character we have never seen before in the Candyman franchise. Sherman was a hook-handed man whom the police believed was responsible for putting a razor blade in a piece of candy that ended up in the hands of a white girl. A young William Burke inadvertently alerted the police of his presence, leading them to beat Sherman to death. Sherman was later exonerated for his crimes when more children in the neighborhood received candy with razor blades in them. However, that wouldn't be the last time that we saw Sherman. Sherman later comes back when William Burke's sister calls upon him in the mirror, killing her immediately. This trauma permanently scars Burke, as he is now motivated to bring back the Candyman in modern day. His plan starts when he first meets Anthony, who wants to know more about the Candyman legend. Things really kick off when Anthony is stung by a bee early on in the film. Over time, it causes his skin to decay. It works its way up his arm and to his face. For the look of Anthony's decay, director Nia DaCosta was inspired in part by David Cronenberg's 1986 horror classic, The Fly. As it spreads, it starts turning into a honeycomb underneath the skin, until it finally erupts all the way up to his face. To create this icky visual effect, the film's makeup effects team was led by J. Anthony Kosar, who said, "It was a great effect, and both fun and challenging to track the many stages of his devolution throughout the film." Kosar used concept designs from the original film to sculpt the prosthetics so that they could get as close to the original as possible. At its peak, the makeup process took 4 hours to apply to Abdul-Mateen in a given day. For Candyman's hook, the team printed a 3D model that was very much in the same vein of the original film. For many of the scenes, Abdul-Mateen would wear a bright green glove to hold the hook, which was later digitally removed in post. Now, I've heard many people complain about the CGI bees that are seen in the final shot, how it's just not as good as the original film that used real bees. However, to be fair, Tony Todd was an absolute champ when they made the original film in 1992. He was stung 23 times while using the real bees. I don't care if Leo ate raw meat or if Joaquin licked real paint. This is commitment that you just don't see these days. I'm sure if this came out today, Todd would have been more celebrated amongst mainstream audiences. Sweet sounds for the sweet, the film score. The film score is composed by Robert Aki Aubrey Lowe. Lowe would visit the set often, a rarity for film composers, wandering about in fenced-in complexes with field recorders. "I went to the row houses in Cabrini Green taking ambient recordings of the location," Lowe says. "I went inside certain buildings to get the natural sound of the empty spaces, as well as the insects, the wind, the helicopters going overhead. It was important and necessary for me to be able to incorporate actual ambient sound from the locations as textural elements into the score." Now, there is no debating that the original score by Philip Glass is an absolute classic. The creepy track, "It Was Always You, Helen," is almost as iconic as the theme from Halloween in a lot of ways. The second you hear it, you know exactly what it is. With that said, I do enjoy Lowe's score as well. It can be truly haunting. It sounds like the vocal choir that was used in Jordan Peele's Us, and it fits very well against the backdrop of a man who is slowly starting to decay. But if I'm being honest, I do wish that Lowe used more of the iconic scores that Glass gave us from the original film. Not to say that Lowe's score isn't good, but once a horror icon such as Candyman has a theme, it's hard to imagine it in any other way. Explaining the ending. Recap. By the third act of the film, many have died because of Candyman, and we learn that Anthony was in fact the baby that was meant to be sacrificed at the end of the original film. Ironically, Anthony would have been perfectly fine had he never summoned Candyman again. The residences of Cabrini Green along with Anne Marie had made a pact back in 1992 to never speak his name again, but since Anthony was digging around, the Candyman returned. It also didn't help that he ran into the one man in Cabrini Green that was hell-bent on bringing Candyman back. You see, despite Candyman killing his sister, Burke views the Candyman as a sort of savior. Since 1992, the residences of Cabrini Green have been pushed out of their homes to make room for the rich. Burke's plan was to turn Anthony into the new Candyman so that he will go after them as a form of vengeance. He cuts off his hand in one of the most brutal scenes in the movie, as Anthony just seems to sit there and take it as he is now in a fugue state. I mean, clearly Burke is a bit crazy. I understand his motivation for doing this, but clearly the death of his sister, amongst the other traumas he has endured over the years, has caused him to fully snap. Brianna is able to escape Burke and eventually kills him, but it's already too late. Just like Burke predicted, the police show up looking for the Say My Name killer, and when they find Anthony dressed as a Candyman, they shoot him without saying a word. Brianna is then given a choice to either say that the police killed Anthony in self-defense, or they'll charge her for being Anthony's accomplice. Brianna, now believing in the Candyman, summons him in the mirror of the police car. Anthony rises to his feet and takes out the cops that are holding her captive. Brianna goes to escape, but sees Anthony has now transformed into the classic Candyman, Daniel Robitaille, who tells her to tell everyone. Candyman in this film is the embodiment of the pain, rage, and wrath of countless black men who have died at the hands of white violence. Candyman is an eternal figure, Peele says. He can't just be a singular, he's a concept and a story. He's a boogeyman, and that means that he applies across the boundaries of time. We want to take what was done in the original film and apply it to an even greater sense of urgency, and demonstrate that the monster has been swept under the carpet for so long. Candyman is an exciting story to tell at any time period because it's so perennial, DaCosta says. The history of violence repeats itself in cycles, and we collectively process drama and grief through stories. So I felt like any time could really be the right time to tell the story of Candyman. On one level, the character of Candyman is a myth and a monster, but as we know, America creates monsters out of black men all the time. It isn't necessarily who they truly are or why they are. I was interested in telling the truth about the pain at the center of black life in America, but also to shine a light on the hope and power of black creativity and community too. Personally speaking, I love the new Candyman. Much like Halloween 2018 and Dr. Sleep, Candyman 2021 is able to stand on its own as its own unique story, but is even more enjoyable if you watch it back to back with the original. DaCosta seems to have a real eye for capturing the horror that plagues this small community, and in no way let me down. To be honest, when first hearing that Peele would only be producing, I was a bit hesitant whether the film would actually be good or not. I was afraid that the studios were simply trading off his name, and it would not bring the same quality that we have known before. However, it is very clear that DaCosta, despite only having 2 features under her belt, knows exactly what she is doing, and is almost as good as Peele himself. I look forward to seeing what she puts out next. At the end of the day, Candyman represents the fear and superstition we all have. Much like Freddy Krueger, he's real simply because we make him real. With the exception of the sequels from the 90s, there was an eloquence and a level of sophistication in the Candyman franchise that almost no other mainstream horror slasher of its kind has ever attained or even attempted. With that said, there are a few questions that I had once the film was over. The first being Brianna's father. Halfway through the film, Brianna and her brother Trent make a point of discussing their father who took his own life. Much like Anthony, he was an artist, and they must decide what to do with the storage unit that contains all of his art. Perhaps the plot point was just a red herring, or meant to give more backstory to who Brianna was as a character. I looked up the character of Gil Cartwright to see if perhaps he was one of the characters mentioned in one of the film's sequels, but it simply doesn't seem to be the case. I honestly thought the character would have had more of a connection to the overall story, as the characters clearly take the time to acknowledge him, but it appears not. There's also the question of Helen and Lyle. Virginia Madsen does reprise her character in the form of an old tape recording, but if you look at the film's IMDb page, it says that she is portrayed by Cassie Kramer, who we see earlier in the film as a librarian. Looking into it further, it turns out that Kramer is also meant to play as the ghost of Helen Lyle as seen in her burnt form wearing a white dress. There's even a brief moment in the first trailer in which we see her sitting in the church as bees are seen swarming in from the windows. However, this never made it into the final film. I'm curious to see if there are any deleted scenes from Candyman when it receives its home release. It would be fantastic to see if there are any ideas for these characters that were ultimately left on the cutting room floor. Until next time guys, thank you so much for watching. I know this format of video is a little bit different from my traditional reviews, and they take a little bit longer to research, but they're ultimately the most fun to put together. If you enjoy these kind of essays, be sure to give the video a thumbs up and share it with friends who also enjoy these type of videos. I have been John here on Burns Reviews, and we will see you next time.